Hello and welcome to the Jim Ruff Show. Today my special guests are Linda Frank from Tacoma and Kit Kittredge from Quilcene, and they are human rights activists. And they're here today. We're going to have a meeting later tonight that I'm facilitating that is about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they're here as invited guests and experts to talk about that. So I thought they would share a little bit of their story of how they became human rights activists, and maybe a little bit of we get a chance to get an inside view of how that works. So welcome, Linda and Kit.
Thanks very much for inviting us.
Good. Yeah. So you guys met in Cairo, apparently. Maybe you could tell a little bit of the story of how that happened.
We did, right? Do you want to? We both live in Washington, so it is kind of funny that we went halfway around the world to
Washington State. Yeah.
Washington State,
Yep.
and went halfway around the world to meet each other. Cairo was where we were staging for our trip to Gaza. We went across the Sinai Desert from Cairo to Al Arish and then up to the Rafah border. So we went with Code Pink, Women for Peace, and the delegation was put together pretty quickly by Medea Benjamin, who's a co-founder of Code Pink and a co-founder of Global Exchange. And I was interested in going on the delegation because I have been working on this issue since 2001.
Were you working on this issue? How did that spark for you?
Well,
I'm jumping ahead, but
that's
yeah.
okay. In the mid-1990s, I was very drawn to Judaism, and for a number of reasons. One among them was that I understood Judaism to be a tradition in which not only were you welcomed to ask questions about what you were being told and what you were being taught, but you were actually encouraged to do that, and that very much appealed to me. And the call to justice, and I found Judaism to be a very poetic tradition, just a lovely, I had heard and read wonderful things about it. So I studied weekly at a temple in Colorado Springs, at a Reformed Judaism temple, and really fell in love with Judaism and had a great experience. But Israel was not discussed at temple in those days. So I didn't even know Palestinians existed. And then I watched a video a couple years later and thought, I need to find out what's happening there. And I didn't until 2001. And
Wow.
so after the events on 9/11, I started to inquire and called my local newspaper and said, hey, could you write a primer about what's happening there? And they said, sorry, won't touch it. But called me back to say, hey, there's a Jewish American and a Palestinian American who are going to be speaking up in your area. So they gave me their contact information, and I got loaded up with information by Bert Walker, who's now deceased, as is Zahi Haddad, who was the Palestinian who was speaking with him. But that was my introduction
That's
to the
great.
issue. And when I heard what the Israeli government, how it was dispossessing Palestinians and violating basically every tenet of Judaism that I had come to learn and love, I felt I needed to be a part of the solution.
Terrific. So then somehow you ended up in Cairo and ran into Kit.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
we both joined the delegation. It was a Code Pink peace delegation to Gaza. And Medea had gone to Gaza directly following Operation Castlet when the Israeli massacre occurred.
Well, hang on. Tell me how you got
That's
sparked.
how we got there.
How did you spark for your interest? How did you?
Well, I'm a Code Pink peace activist, and that was the initial spark for me, to be honest. I knew of the issue, but I was not intimately involved until I actually went to Gaza in 2009.
So you went to Gaza, and what happened?
Well, it was a peace delegation with 66 members, I believe, the first one. I've been on 5, so I get them mixed up, but I believe there were
60.
60 men in 10 countries, I believe, 11
Something
countries.
like that.
It's an international delegation, and our intent was to go and document the stories, hear from the people, meet with UNRWA, United Nations Work Relief Agency, sponsored us, and we met with many different civil society organizations, went to hospitals, went to schools, the schools that were left after the bombing.
So you're in
So
Palestine.
we're in Gaza.
Yeah, in Gaza.
Palestine. Mhm.
Okay.
And so, but we met in Cairo. That's where all of the delegates like Linda said, convened and then went to,
I see.
which is a 5-hour bus ride over across the Sinai and through the one border that people are allowed in, because it is under siege. And it was then, and it still is. Some people can go through Erez, but very few.
So so you're just an ordinary person walking around, and somehow you got into Code Pink. You got excited about this issue. Tell me about that.
Well, for me, I've been with Code Pink for since Bush got elected, basically. That's when Code Pink it's Code Pink because it's not going to be Code Yellow, Orange, Green, and Red, which Bush wanted to have to instill fear. We were going to be Code Pink. We're going to work for peace, and that's where that came from.
So, and then a lot of activists came together to go to Gaza and work for peace by telling the stories, sharing the stories, and helping others understand what's happening.
Educational process. Many journalists were there. We had doctors, lawyers, engineers.
Alice
teachers.
Walker.
Alice Walker went.
Right.
Craig and Cindy Glory went with us in the first march one, I believe. So we a lot of different walks of life, people that were passionate about the Palestinian issue.
I see. So both of you have gone there and felt the pain of the Palestinian people, and now you are back here and you're wanting to take action in their behalf.
Absolutely.
And not just the pain of the Palestinian people, the whole region is in agony, really. I feel. I went to Jordan afterwards and worked with Iraqi women refugees, but it's all very much a blight that has just descended on the region. And the U.S. is so complicit because of our aid and our, having governments that are puppets to our, whether it's a position where we want our military or whether it's power issue there with the economics. It's a great military deal. We give the $15 million a day to Israel in turn to buy back armaments. So that's in turn.
So we give them the money and they buy the armaments, right?
Yes,
okay.
so it's this revolving door, and then they get used. And the Palestinians happened to be the recipients last year with Made in USA.
Okay,
it's not just the Palestinians who are in
suffering.
pain.
Yeah.
No, and there are many Israelis who are very against what their government is doing, just like there are many Americans who are against what our government is doing. So it's more of a human rights issue. It's a policy issue.
Okay.
And
so now you're back here, and you want to act. And so tell us what this action is, or what's the suggested. How did you come to an action that now you are pursuing?
I've been active on the issue, as I mentioned, since 2001, and I thought that I foresaw that a three-prong approach, I thought, would really impact the situation. That if Congress actually knew what was happening, that would make a difference. I thought if the media knew and accurately reported, there are many, many reasons why we in the United States don't get accurate coverage at all. Books have been written about it, studies have been written. There's a good study up on If Americans Knew. Something like 2% of the Palestinian children's deaths get headlined, and 105% of the Israeli children's deaths get headlined. So
what do you mean by that? I don't see how that works.
Palestinian children are killed and not reported in the news.
Right, but you can't have 105%. Is that what you mean?
Because they're reported multiple times.
I see. Well,
okay.
The same death would be, or the one Israeli in jail
Yes.
where there's 9,000 Palestinians in jail. I don't have easy access to it, but I have a booklet called Remember These Children. And it chronicles all the Israeli and all the Palestinian children that were killed from the start of the Second Intifada, which was in 2000, and I think it was March 2003. And you open this booklet and you flip through and you see page after page after page after page of Palestinian children's names and how they were killed, most of them killed by gunshot wounds to the head or to the upper body. Until you get approximately 84 Palestinian children were killed before the first Israeli child was killed in a suicide bombing. And so it made sense to me it connected something that I had read in the New York Times that made no sense to me at the time, where some Palestinian had said, "What were we supposed to do? They were killing our children." And I remembered reading that and thinking, what's he talking about? Well, I didn't know that piece of the story, that 84 Palestinian children had been killed. And again, gunshot wounds, head, upper body, so clearly snipers. And so these are the pieces of the stories that are not told in the U.S. press. So I took it upon myself to do press briefings. I would put together packages, send them out to the media. I lobbied Congress a lot in groups, various groups of people, wrote letters,
And what do you write
regularly.
them? Just to tell them the information?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I get on the ground information. So unfortunately, I get a lot, as Kit does too. We're on various listservs where the news, like I don't recall seeing anything in the recent news about a 91-year-old Palestinian man killed in Gaza 2 days ago, and his 15 or 16-year-old grandson and friend.
Or the 2-year-old that last year in September I was there, who was shot by a sniper and killed.
So you're saying
those
that the
things are not
Israelis sit on their high towers or something, and they just aim and take target
Yeah, the
practice or
I was shot at
something?
2 weeks ago.
The technology is
You were
pretty
there.
phenomenal. And so I thought Congress, media, and community. So I held community fora. I started out in 2005, that was one of the reasons I was nominated for the Greater Tacoma Peace Prize. I was nominated in 2005 and then again in 2010. And so I invited Israeli speakers and Jewish American speakers and Christian American speakers and Muslim, had a whole diversity of speakers
Kind of what's happening tonight here.
to help people fill in, learn about the issue. And what I came to see over the course of 9 years or 10 years, I really started active in the winter of 2002, is that while those things are helpful, they just weren't getting the job done.
Right.
The peace process, the two-state solution has been going on for 17 years.
Yes.
And unfortunately, the offer of 2000, which was billed as a very generous offer for the Palestinians, was something that no human being could be expected to accept. It was basically I have a postcard and we'll give you a close-up of that later on, but it was basically for a piece of Swiss cheese. It was for disconnected Bantustans, little pieces of territory that are separated by Jewish-only roads. B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, came out with a recent report called By Hook or By Crook that cites 42% of the West Bank being consumed already by the settlement network.
Okay, all right, I'm getting a piece of this, and
Okay.
there's more to go, I know. But let me just jump to where my mind's going. You guys have done a lot of thinking, a lot of work in this area. You've got a lot of experience. A lot of people like myself and others maybe don't know. We don't have access to accurate information. I get my hundreds of emails too, but they're on different things.
Right.
So if you had to pinpoint, what is the problem? What is the cause here? What's going on?
Pinpoint, that's a tough one because there are multiple factors. Militarism. A lot of people are making a lot of money off this conflict. Netanyahu had said 9/11 was good for America, and he meant more in terms of that jump-started this war on terror. But Israeli companies, the companies that are involved in the security industry, Seattle Police sends delegations over to get trained in Israel. So the Israeli economy has taken off.
Because of just the military
Because of
economics.
our 9/11. And American companies also are, the contractors are making money hand over fist. I mean, I see it sort of like Jabba the Hutt, if you remember from Star Wars, just stuffing babies in his mouth. It's disgusting that the amount of war profiteering that's occurring and the amount of people who are making money off civilian deaths. And I don't care whether I do care. I care that they're Israeli civilian deaths, that they're Palestinian civilian deaths, that they're American civilian deaths, that they're civilian deaths anywhere around the world.
Right.
And Dennis Halliday, who was a former Secretary General to the United Nations and quit when the U.S. slapped sanctions on Iraq, we killed 500,000 Iraqi children with our sanctions, said, until we make peacemaking as lucrative as war making, we've got an uphill battle. So, we're in it for the long, I'm in it for the long haul. I don't expect to.
So you have an economic core to this problem. Is that your position too,
I
Kit?
agree that that's a huge part of it, yes.
Yeah, is you want to add some other piece or?
Well, displacing people as we did with the Native Americans here.
Yeah.
It's an invitation,
Okay.
what the agreement that was made in 48, 49.
So if you
It was
have
a
this-
recipe for disaster, and
Ah.
it was a total displacement of people, and I think that it's been.
So if you kind of legalize and jointly sanction the displacement of people, then you've opened the door to a whole mess of people taking economic profiteering, really, is what you're...
Plus it's just a human rights violation.
Yes,
And
yeah.
then to put them under siege, and then to attack them, we're talking international law violations, extraordinary.
War
Wow.
crimes, yeah. It's a war crime
It's-
be militarily attacking a population and not enable them egress. The Gazans, people of Gaza, could not exit Gaza.
And
They
they still
could not
can't.
get out of the
And
way.
they still can't.
And
Not
they
really.
still can't. Now, supposedly the
Minimum.
borders opened a little bit for students, but I
For
just
trade.
talked to one of my translators who...
So, okay.
Yeah, it's a bad situation. In fact, when we went to Gaza, I didn't think we were going to get in. I thought I was
We
going to
didn't know.
protest on the Egyptian border to
Which-
just call attention to the siege.
Oh.
That was my
all set to do
motive for
All right.
going,
Every time we go, it's like that.
because
You
it
really
is
don't
under
know if you're
siege.
gonna get
It's
in.
locked border.
Okay, so you've got, we're going good here. We got two major solution strategies of the three that you were articulating. One was to inform Congress, the other was to inform the people, and neither of those is really working or somehow not carrying the weight. And I don't think you got to the third.
No, and so now what happens is the Palestinians actually in 2005, a lot of people don't realize Palestinians have tried nonviolent resistance for decades.
Yeah.
We just don't hear about it. So in 2005, Palestinians said, look, we need the world's help. We are calling for the world to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. This helped to bring an end to South African apartheid. There is an apartheid in Israel, as much as people want to argue that no, it's not actually in Israel, it's just in the occupied territories. No, it's throughout. It's the entire region is, to varying degrees, has elements of apartheid. There was a study done, a South African study, that found Israel's occupation has elements of colonialism and apartheid. And apartheid is against, international law. So the Palestinians put out a call and said, please folks, come and support our nonviolent resistance to Israel's 43, well in 2005 it was whatever it was, 39-year or something occupation,
Right.
military occupation of our land and lives. And so it was after Operation Cast Lead, the world started to really say, okay, it's going from bad to worse. The infractions, the assaults on civilians are becoming more egregious and blatant, and there's nobody holding Israel accountable for that, and so it's going to be up to civilians. So people started to, and not just people, but now the government of Norway, the government of Sweden have divested from their Scotland, Ireland, the
Spain.
unions just voted yesterday. That's huge, all throughout the UK.
Okay, so this is a movement
So this is a
that
move.
an international movement that originated out of Palestine. Now, how does it come out of Palestine? It's not the Palestinian
Civil
government.
society, 170 unions and teachers unions and women's groups
In
and-
Palestine.
in Palestine have said,
Made this
please,
kind of statement.
come
All
help
kinds
us.
of groups,
Come help us, and here's the way you can do it.
Because our governments aren't doing it. The
Yeah.
Palestinian government isn't doing it, the Israeli government isn't doing it, the US
Negotiations
government
aren't
isn't doing it.
working.
Our governments have failed us terribly.
They
So
didn't
this
even
is the
invite
people.
Hamas to the peace talks, and they were democratically elected government for Gaza. So they expected the peace talks to be, okay, there's peace talks, there are negotiations going on. They weren't even representing 1.5 million people from Gaza who had a democratically elected government. We don't
Yeah, you're-
acknowledge them because they're terrorists, but of course, the US being some of the worst terrorist government, and the other governments that we meet with who are terrorists, that doesn't matter, but
Okay,
that's
so-
a huge.
So I mean, for some of us who are just more beginners in this, I'm loving hearing your story. This is great stuff. Part of it is Gaza, and part of it is the West Bank, right? Now,
both of them.
They're all captive, though.
they're all captive.
captive
Why are
people.
we only talking about Gaza, just to bring that into
Oh,
play?
we're not. She was talking about the West Bank and the Swiss cheese. That's the
I
West
see.
Bank.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Gaza's under siege, but it's all occupied. And people say, oh, in 2005, Israel pulled out of Gaza and gave them their freedom. No, they didn't. They pulled the settlers and the soldiers out, but Gaza remained occupied because if you control a border, you're an occupier.
And they bombed them after they left also and destroyed. many, many homes.
So how does Palestine make this statement if Gaza and the West Bank can't even talk to one another, right?
Well, and that's a wedge that the U.S. has very much driven in. We don't hear about that there was a U.S. planned coup. There's a good Vanity Fair article. The author's name is Rose. And he has talked to U.S. government officials, so he's got some pretty good sources, seems like a valid story, about how the U.S. funded Fatah forces in Egypt, and they came back into Gaza with these big SUVs and new weapons and brand new uniforms, and Hamas sort of went, what's going on? We kind of get the picture, something's moving here. So it's the classic divide and conquer. It's a classic tactic of oppressors, oppressive governments, to say, get in there and divide up the people who we're occupying, who we're oppressing, and let them fight amongst themselves. And so the wedge that has been driven between Gaza and the West Bank is principally that the government of Gaza, the democratically elected government of Gaza, is being asked to renounce violence. Well, why don't we ask Israel to renounce violence? Doesn't that seem fair? You ask one side, you ask the other. Whereas international law actually provides an occupied people the right to resist, even violently, not civilians. So that has to be condemned and is condemned. Nobody gets to target civilians. So, but they have a right to resist. So renounce violence, abide by previous agreements. Oslo Accords was to stop settlement building. Israel didn't abide by Oslo. So how come we're not asking Israel to abide by previous agreements as well? So I think those two are good things. Stop violence. Yes, stop violence, all violence. Abide by previous agreements, but they're asking the government of Gaza to recognize Israel's right to exist. Now, Gazan government has recognized Israel and recognized that Israel, nobody thinks, I don't think, that Israel's going away. I mean, they're extremists, yes, everybody's got a spectrum and has extremists. But to ask the Palestinians to recognize Israel's right to exist goes very deep into the issues. It means acknowledging or saying that Israel had a right to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. I don't know any people that would be willing to do that. So that's a precondition of peace talks that's on the table.
And also, is Israel asked to recognize Palestine's right to exist and honor it? I mean, it's not reciprocated.
So there's a lack of reciprocity in terms of the way this whole thing's coming down. And at the core of it is a economic driver where the economics of the situation are such that people in political control really don't want to lose this battle. They don't want to have the battle go away. They want to keep that, maintain that battle strategy.
I don't know if it's the core. It is a big chunk of the core.
It's a big chunk of it.
Yeah.
So pinpoint the core, if you can.
I mean, we were talking about different things. The displacement.
The
creation of the state of Israel, and then the displacement creates an incredible amount of. Yeah, this is a great postcard. It just tells you where it was.
Well, I have my middle-aged personal summer here. This is my little fan. But these postcards are terrific. People can get them tonight at the event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the other piece. Which was another huge wedge. You take a land that was occupied by Christians, Muslims, Jews, for centuries.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, now it's a whole new state, and you all have to live elsewhere.
Okay.
Millions of people left.
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered.
Okay.
There's definitely an ethnic cleansing going on. From the beginning of the creation of the state.
Wow, that's got to be a code word for the Jews to be really upset to hear that, I'm sure, huh? To hear, when you hear ethnic cleansing.
I'm sure. I hope it's enough for anybody to be upset, whether it happens in
anywhere,
Croatia or Iraq or Afghanistan.
Well, one of the things that intrigues me about what you're saying, and we've got about 5 minutes, I guess, or so, but is out of Palestine has somehow come a statement where it sort of is the people of Palestine saying, here's what we want, here's what we need.
Absolutely.
And then there are people positioned like yourselves who are striving to take that message and share it and generate support for that message.
Absolutely.
Is that right? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's cool.
Governments
and of course, that's kind of what
the process that's going on to gain back the human rights of Palestinian people has not worked.
Yeah.
This is this is the
Yeah.
most nonviolent, most
That's great.
effective way. And so we're supporting being peace activists and human rights activists. We choose to embrace that and
Yeah.
to help it move
So
forward.
we can.
So this
yeah.
is Ahmed Abdullah. It's a terrible photograph of him. This man is a refugee from 1948. His village was purged. His entire family, except he and his mother, were survived, were killed. And he was telling us that talk about basic human rights. This man has never been permitted by Israel to meet his grandchildren. They live 25 miles away in the West Bank. According to Amira Haas, an Israeli journalist, Israel drove a wedge starting in about 1991, started to separate Gaza and the West Bank. And certainly Hamas is actually a creation of Israel. I mean, to get the Palestinians away from supporting Yasser Arafat. So again, you see that divide and conquer. But he told us with tears in our eyes, he said, how come I can't just have a hug from my grandchildren?
Yes.
Another young translator of ours in Gaza had 4 scholarships to study abroad. 2 in the United States, 2 in Jordan, and Israel wouldn't let her out to fulfill any of those scholarships. So
Okay, well,
basic human rights
yeah,
movement
yeah.
and family and
Right.
education are being violated. That's
Well,
what
something's-
Palestinians are saying. Give
right.
us our rights.
And yet, if we were to somehow, this is my bias, okay? My bias is that something around, if the people of Palestine could somehow have that conversation and say, here's what we need, that's one thing. And if the people of Israel could somehow have a creative, collaborative conversation and say what they need, and somehow have a conversation among the people, it feels like all kinds of wonderful doors would open.
You're absolutely right, Jim. There's a great speech on the web by Gila Sversky. She's an Israeli friend of mine,
Yeah.
and she's with the Coalition of Women for Peace. And she gave a talk to the United Nations Security Council to say, hey, fellas, 1% of women, of peacemakers are supposed to be women. But anyway, she says, let me tell you about the peacemaking that has gone on all these years between Israelis and Palestinians. We women have been meeting and they've got wonderful relationships. So, and Ta'ayush is an Arab-Israeli organization. There's a lot of interface between the people. So this is from the grassroots, BDS,
So that's the
Boycott,
heart-
Divestment.
that's part of
It is.
a
It's
really
the
positive one.
people.
So I have to
the
wrap
governments
up.
out. Okay.
I have to wrap up, but I really appreciate your coming on, and we'll see tonight. We'll learn more. But Linda Frank and Kit Kittredge, thank you very much.
Thank
We
you very
really
much.
appreciate hearing your story. Thank you.
And we'll get you this for the,
Cool.
for the show.
Camera,
You can
okay.
do a close-up on that. Thank you so much.